So yeah, no, welcome, and we'll get started. Remember, just type in questions in the Q&A box, and I'll answer them at the end of the session. Just that we have enough people that I don't want to interrupt while we're going, just because we can go off on all sorts of interesting discussions. So anyway, so today we're going to talk about the current state of water quality in Belgrade. Just an overview. I'm going to talk about our data from last summer on all 7 lakes. But underneath those different lakes, I'm going to talk about some of these other side experiments that we've done. So on East Pond, we did a wakeboat experiment last summer. Over the winter, we did some experiments under the ice on North Pond. Recently, the Great Pond Watershed Management Committee has been meeting. As part of the science element of that, we've been looking into some of the data. So I'll present some of that data alongside with the typical data for the other lakes. Also going to talk about future concerns for the Belgrade lakes. Finally, I'm going to show you where you can get real-time data once we start collecting data again on the internet, and then we'll have time for questions. So first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we do on what do we do for water quality monitoring in the Belgrades? And the first thing is we're measuring temperature and oxygen profiles. And we do that using this instrument called an in situ multi-parameter sonde. So we go out and we can measure at very small scale. So roughly we get measurements every 10 to 20 centimeters going down to the water column. And that lets us really see where the stratification is and where the oxygen starts dropping. We also do our Secchi disk measurements, which we go out when we're doing those. And then every other time we go out, roughly every other week in the summer, we collect samples for analysis on the ICP OES at Colby. And this is how we get numbers for total phosphorus. This is also how we know how much metals like iron and aluminum are in the water column. So those are our pretty typical water quality profiling that we do out as a team. But to be fair, there's a lot of people who make all this happen. Every summer we have our interns from Colby who play an integral part in this data collection. Then we also have volunteers who take us out on the lake on some of these shoulder seasons where we don't have the Colby students to help us out. And then also I want to thank the 7 Lake staff who step up again during these shoulder seasons to help with the water quality monitoring at this time. So here are our lakes. You should be familiar with them if you're from this area. I'm going to go through all 7 of them one by one. So first we're going to talk about East Pond because it's at the top of the watershed. East Pond has a max depth of 25 feet and a mean depth of 18 feet. So it's one of our shallower lakes. So before I start talking about this graph, I actually want to walk through because I'm going to show this type of graph for every single lake that we have. So the first thing is on the top panel, it shows us temperature. And so the dark blue colors are cold water down to about 40 degrees, and the dark red colors are warm water, so up to about 85 degrees. So you can see how the temperature is changing over the course of the summer. In the bottom panel, we have our dissolved oxygen. So when it's dark blue, that means we have lots of oxygen. And when it's red, that means we have low oxygen. We consider anoxia to be about 2 milligrams per liter or 2 parts per million. And so that's the red colors. Yellow is about 5 parts per million. And that's where you start getting, like, fish don't like living in water that is less than 5 parts per million. So we have kind of 2 states of anoxia and hypoxia, which are things we look out for. So that's what those contour plots, those heat map plots, are showing us. Then the Secchi disk measurements are plotted on top of the temperature. And then finally, down on the bottom, we have the phosphorus concentrations. And so the size of that circle tells you the concentration. So that's kind of a reference circle right there in the corner. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but so you can compare the circles to that size. So like, okay, it's less than 25 micrograms per liter. Micrograms per liter and parts per billion are the same thing. And so that way we can see, do we have little phosphorus or do we have a lot of phosphorus? So those are the key elements of these plots, and that's really pretty much summarizes the main data that we collect on the lakes over the summer. So to get into specifically into East Pond in 2019, first we see that it stayed pretty well mixed all summer, so there wasn't much stratification. And this is something that's new since the alum treatment, to be honest. Before, it used to stratify some, and that's why I used to get anoxia on the bottom because of the stratification. And now the water is much clearer, so it doesn't really stratify in the summer like the way it used to. We still had a couple of instances of anoxia, it looks like, in the summer, but the whole point of doing the alum treatment is that even when there's anoxia, the phosphorus doesn't get released from the sediments, because that's what the mechanism behind the alum treatment does. So the average Secchi last year is on 19 feet, which is great. The volume average phosphorus was down to 6 parts per billion, which is really low. So that's awesome. So we're really happy about the way things are looking on East Pond. But of course, one of the questions with East Pond and the alum treatment there is how long is this going to last? Like, we know it looks like it's working short term, but how long can this investment that was made on this lake be expected to extend? And so one of the things that the East Pond Association was concerned about was potentially the impact of wake boats on disturbing the alum treatment. So last summer, we did an experiment where we tried to measure the currents from wake boats going over the bottom of the lake. So I'm sure most people are familiar with wake boats now, but wake surfing's growing in popularity, particularly with summer camps. Many of our lakes have seen an increase in this type of boating activity, and this can have potential water quality impacts. There's shoreline erosion from the big waves. There's erosion from the wake underneath the boat because they're specifically designed to point the wake downwards. Also, which we're not really going to talk about invasive species today, but you can transport invasive species in the ballast water. So that's another water quality impact. So those are kind of the key ones that we're concerned about with this type of boating activity. So in terms of the context, so again, 2018 we did alum treatment over the deepest part of the lake. So that's where we treated the sediments. And we wanted to know, could these sediments possibly be disturbed by wake boating activity? And so there's 2 ways this can happen. And one is directly by the wakes directly impacting the sediments. And then the second is if potentially you disturb shallower sediments which weren't treated, then they get resuspended in the water, but then get deposited on top of the sediments that were treated. So these type of things can would reduce the longevity of an alum treatment. Fortunately, Camp Manitou, who invested in this alum treatment as well, was very interested to make sure that their boating activities, because they have a wake boat, wasn't negatively impacting the lake. So they helped us out with an experiment in August 2019 to try and test to see whether or not the wake boats can hit the treated sediments. So the way we did this is we went to the deep hole in the lake, where it's indicated by the red dot there. And what we did is we put these instruments that are called aquadops, or acoustic Doppler current profilers. And what they do is they measure water velocities by sending an acoustic signal that reflects off particles and bubbles in the water, and it uses the Doppler effect, which you learned about in high school physics, to measure the velocity of the water. We also deploy what we call sediment traps, and the idea of this is try and measure how much sediment is settling down in the water. Unfortunately, one of them got dragged, so it tipped over, and then the other we put in about 15 feet of water. We wanted to put it not in the treated area. We wanted to put it outside the treated area. So we anchored the boat. Jerry Tipper helped us do this. We anchored the boat, put it down, and then we pulled up the anchor. I pulled up a whole bunch of vegetation, because one of the side effects of the clear water in East Pond is now you get vegetation growth down at 15 feet, because when you improve water clarity, that's what happens. And so unfortunately, when that happened, it pulled up a lot of sediment and it went along with the vegetation. So we couldn't use the data. We couldn't use that sediment trap because it got contaminated from the boat anchor. So that's what the objective is, to try and just understand some of the water movement and sediment movement in the lake to see if that might reduce longevity of the treatment. So Camp Manitou ran the boat over their boat, or the instrument's right near that orange buoy, so they would run the boat over the instrument. We did 3 different configurations 3 times. So Sharon helped us put it, Sharon Mann from Seven Lakes Lines helped put it down with divers. And so here we're going to talk a little bit about the data that we got. So in this plot here, what we have is something called the signal amplitude. And what that tells you is how much stuff is in the water for the acoustic beam to reflect off of. So the brighter the color, the more stuff there is in the water. So that's going to reflect off sediments, and that's going to reflect off bubbles. And so we can very kind of clearly see the different wakes in this signal amplitude. The first is, so the Camp Manitou passed it over first in the surfing mode, so in the wake surfing mode, and that's about 10 miles per hour, has a full ballast to really keep that boat sunk down, and it has a wake plate. And you can see, we see the wake, so this is in meters on the side, so it's about 6 feet from the surface, we're seeing the signature of the wake boat going down. Then they next ran it over in their extreme wakeboarding mode, so it's faster, still with full ballast, but no wake plate, and we see it about 3 feet down. We can see the signature of the wake. And then water skiing, even faster, but with no ballast and no wake plate, and we see it about 3 feet down as well. So it's pretty similar to the extreme wakeboarding case. So there's definitely more penetration of wake in the wake surfing mode than in the other types of boating modes. And that is somewhat by design to generate these big waves that can be surfed off of. The velocity measurements are a little less clear. We do seem to see an increase when the wake boat's going over, but it's not a consistent trend. So it's a little hard to take a story away from that. Part of that is just some sampling configuration that I won't go into, but how fast we can sample with these instruments is only once per second. So if you think about a boat going over pretty quickly, that's not a lot of samples we get in a given time. But it does appear that the velocities increase in the water when the boat passes in surfing mode as compared to the other 2 boating modes. So coming back to water quality, so here we have that same graph that was there that I put on at the beginning, and so we had continued to improve Seki in East Pond and low phosphorus, but we had a small increase in both in late July and into August. And so what I just put up here is another plot. In particular, I want you to focus on the bottom panel. The top panel just shows us that it didn't really it only went anoxic that one time. So we don't expect this to be phosphorus coming from sediments. If we look at the bottom panel, what we see is phosphorus on one side and iron and aluminum on the other. And what we can see is all 3 of these are increasing and decreasing at the same time. And that's starting about July to August. So the thing is, so when you have phosphorus coming out of sediments, you expect to see iron, but you don't expect to see aluminum. So the fact that we see all 3 of these indicates that we might have some possible sediment transport. And it doesn't necessarily wake boat activity, but this kind of spike in these in the phosphorus and alongside the iron and aluminum during peak kind of boating time on the lake indicates we might all combined boating activity might be having an impact on the phosphorus in the lake and can have an impact on phosphorus in all our lakes. So what are our conclusions out of this? So what we see is that regular boat wakes generate bubbles down to about 3 feet, and wake boats are about twice that, about 7 feet. And this is what we tell from the signal amplitude. We can't tell as much from the velocity measurements, but the wake boats do not appear to go deep enough over the treated area to disturb the alum treatment. That doesn't preclude disturbing shallower sediments, which can then be suspended and redeposited on top of the treated sediments. But to avoid disturbing sediments underneath the boat, wake boats should be operated in water that's greater than 10 feet, basically. And that with the shoreline, with how far away you need to be from the shoreline in a lot of lakes, like in East Pond, that's an easy, if you're X number of feet from the shoreline, you're going to be in over 10 feet of water. Other lakes you might not be in, so that's something to keep in mind for wake boat operation for protecting our water quality. We do want to do some future work with this, and part of that is look at how some of the shoreline erosion elements of this by putting the sensors closer to the shore and be able to look at the size of these wakes. The others are look more at the sediment transport, try to redeploy these sediment traps and design them better so they don't tip over. But also, we know that on salmon, there's 4 wake boats that are operating, and it's a much smaller lake in general. And so, trying to look at what the impact of having a bunch of boats in a smaller area. So even though salmon's much deeper, it's a smaller area, and so we might have different types of water quality impacts in the 2 different types. We might not have any wake boats this summer because the camps might not be running, but it doesn't mean that we can't start looking at some of the impacts still. So if you have questions about this, pop them in the questions and answers, and we'll come back to it at the end. So, moving on a bit. So next we're going to move down our chain of lakes in North Pond. And this is also another one of our shallower lakes, so with a max depth of 20 feet. So in North Pond, first off, we all know the last 2 years North Pond has had some challenges water quality wise. So looking at this year in particular, so we definitely saw an improvement over 2018, which is good. And one thing that we can see is that we had less stratification develop in North Pond this year, so that was good because that helps prevent some of the anoxic developing. We still had a couple bursts of anoxic periods in the lake in July and August during kind of those peak months. So the conditions are better than 2018, but they're still not great. The average Secchi depth is about 13 feet, which is the lowest, which is the shallowest in all the Belgrades, but it's better than it was in 2018. So you can see very much that it started okay, and then basically in August, it started increasing. I did forget to mention, I put the markers on the bottom, but the plots are in day of year, but the beginning of the plot is May, the end of the plot is November, and you can see where I've marked July and September, so give you a sense of where we are during the year. So it did creep steadily up towards the end of August, but it did not hit the lows it did in 2018. So that's good. But you can also see there's a fair amount of phosphorus in the water, and the volume average phosphorus was 18 parts per billion, which compared to 6 in East Pond. So there's still a lot of phosphorus moving around in that lake. It has quite a developed watershed that probably contributes, but I think we're in kind of hopefully in a clearing out mode. The residence time is low rather, so that means we hope the lake will get flushed out, and hopefully next year will be better than it was this year and better than 2018. So one other thing we did on North Pond is, with the help of Jody and some of the North Pond Association measurement members, is that we did some experiments under the ice on North Pond. And so North Pond actually has one of the longer ice off records in the Belgrades. There's a long one, there's about 100 years on Messalonsky. If anybody actually has for the others, I actually haven't, Lake Stewards of Maine only has data going back to 2000. So if you know of someone who's been keeping track of ice off dates for longer than that on Great Pond or Long Pond or East Pond, then please, or McGraw and Salmon, please let me know, because it'd be great to get that data. But through Lake Stewards of Maine, we have data on ice off on North Pond, and basically I think all of us some kind of sense that there's been a change in ice off over the last decades, and over the last 50 years, it's come off 9 days earlier on average, basically, than it has in the past. And so we're doing experiments to try and understand how water flows under the ice, particularly once the snow's gone and it's just the sunlight's just penetrating through ice, and how that creates movement and how that influences the ice breakup in the spring. So we put that same instrument, that acoustic Doppler current profiler, under the ice in North Pond in the winter. We also put these thermistors, which measure temperature. We kind of buried them, we froze them into the ice so we can measure the temperature right underneath the ice. We also put the oxygen sensor that North Pond Association bought this last year into the ice with some other thermistors. That's what Lauren and Amy are holding on this buoy here, so that we can understand, we know that the lake goes anoxic under the ice, and so we want to understand more about anoxia under the ice and what the extent of that anoxia is. what that might mean for fish habitats and what that might mean for summer water quality, because these are a lot of open questions. We put them on this transect here. This is just kind of a side profile. And the idea is to try and measure these currents as things are going under the ice. We are collecting everything tomorrow, so I don't actually have data to show you on this, but I wanted to talk about the exciting things we've done in partnership with the North Pond Association and with Colby. So next time I'll have exciting plots to show flow patterns under the ice. So moving down the chain of lakes here, we are on to Great Pond. That, of course, is the biggest lake in the Belgrades by surface area, and it's 69 feet deep, 21 with a mean depth of 21 feet. So while it's the biggest, it's not the deepest. That belongs to Nesselonsky and Long Pond. So here we have our data from Great Pond from 2019. Now, Great Pond is the first lake that we're showing that has stratification through the summer. So you can see that basically between June and July, it sets up and it stays stratified all the way till October. And as a result of that stratification, we slowly get this decrease of oxygen down at the bottom. And it gets worse and worse and worse until the lake turns over basically at the end of October. And as it gets worse and worse and worse, the anoxic area, you get more phosphorus coming out of the lake. But fortunately for Great Pond, those deep holes in the lake are actually a relatively small proportion of the lake. So when you do a volume average of the phosphorus, so knowing how much volume is at each depth, then the average in the lake is only 10 parts per billion. So that's not actually too bad overall. And average secchi depth is 18 feet. So that's still pretty good as well. So that was the state of Great Pond this past summer. It actually looks like there's a lot of summers, to be honest. There's some variation from year to year when we have an onset, when we have anoxia set in, and when it leaves, and how much phosphorus comes out. But in general, there's a similar trend every year from the 5 years that Colby has been collecting data. So where we really have these detailed pictures of what's going on. So you've probably seen this picture from Whitney King, and this is basically looking at how the change in anoxia over the time. So as part of the Great Pond watershed management plan, we've been looking at all the data from the lake to try and determine possible management strategies. And so one of the key things is dealing with this anoxia that is increasing. So with this plot, what it's showing is that since the 80s that we've had an increase in the region of the lake that goes anoxic. And one way we quantify this is something called the anoxic factor, which is an indication of the area of the lake over time that goes anoxic. And you can see there's definitely been a steady trend from it not going anoxic at all back in the late 80s to what's called an anoxic factor of 10 right around now. So for some kind of reference, that's really right at this border between what are called oligotrophic lakes, is really clear lakes, and then mesotrophic lakes, which is the next stage. Then when you get to an anoxic factor of 30, that's when you're starting to hit your eutrophic lakes. So Great Pond is still pretty far from getting to the point where the anoxia the anoxic factor would be eutrophic. It's still it's right on that boundary between oligotrophic and mesotrophic. But of course, there's a trend, and so we want to keep an eye on that. And that's what we've been looking. These trends are things we were looking at as part of the science team. I also wanted to just give a brief update on GLIO. We have a lot of volunteers on the lakes who do GLIO counts for us. So this is Gliotrichia. It's stained yellow in this picture, but normally it's white. So you can see it visually with your eye, and people use this counting scale to try and get an estimate of what the density of Gliotrichia is, so we can look at trends in space and time. So these are all the people who have volunteered to do gliotrichia measurements off their docks. If you're interested in helping out with this, we can always use more data, so please get in touch. But I just wanted to show kind of the range of data over the past 5 years. And so how you read these box plots, so those red lines are medians, which means they're the most, basically the middle of So most of the time from 2015 to 2017, people didn't see any gliotrichia when they counted, but there's times where it goes all the way up to 5. So certainly in 2018, it looked like that increased. 2019 was better than 2018, but actually what was really kind of key is that nobody submitted any measurements that were greater than 2 in 2019. So that's really good, because that means that, going back here, we're not into the worst phases of gliotrichia density, that we still have pretty low gliotrichia overall. And while particularly if you feel like gliotrichia is a nuisance on your dock, I definitely like you to help participate in our monitoring so we can document it, because that's what we need to do, is to document these trends so we understand what might be causing the increases in gliotrichia, because gliotrichia is still this mystery in a lot of ways to the science community. So trying to understand what causes gliotrichia blooms is something that we're keen to continue with the assistance of Colby. So that's Great Pond. Moving on to McGraw and salmon. So they're kind of paired together. McGraw is another shallow lake, and then salmon is a deeper lake, as you know. So starting with McGraw, this year we actually saw stratification in McGraw, which we really don't normally do. And actually, this is many years you can see down to the Secchi depth, or the Secchi depth is down to the bottom for much of the summer. So this year we actually did see a decrease in the average Secchi depth in McGraw overall. The other thing is we saw anoxia set in, which we really actually haven't seen in the past. It seems to have had some, the phosphorus was about 14 parts per billion, the volume average phosphorus, which is one of the higher values actually in the lake. And we're not seeing that in terms of blooms. And in fact, when I look at the algae, the type of algae that are in McGraw, it's all the type of algae you associate with healthy lakes. But it does kind of indicate that we need to keep our eye on the lake. And I'm going to show this plot looks scary because that is the phosphorus in Salmon Lake. And so the thing about salmon is that it has a bit of a deep hole. And so when the stratification sets in really early, and you can see that already, it's already going anoxic at the beginning of the summer, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And that's just because the way the bathymetry of the lake is, it just keeps that water down there and it keeps it trapped and no oxygen getting into it. So that means you have a lot of phosphorus coming up. But on the benefit, the plus side, the volume of water that's down there is actually not all that big. So when you do an average, you get these numbers, these big circles are something like 100 parts per billion, but the average over the volumetric average is more like 20 parts per billion, which is actually still quite high. And so McGraw and salmon have higher phosphorus levels than one might expect, given the water quality that we see. So it's definitely something we're keeping an eye on. As you can see, the average Secchi depth in salmon is 19 feet, so it's even better than Great Pond. But what happens for residents who know theirs, who live there through the winter, is you see in November, once the lake finally turns over, all this phosphorus mixes up and you get an algal bloom in the autumn. So that seems to happen pretty reliably every year. But in general, the water quality in the summer can be quite good. So all these lakes are complex systems, and everyone is quite different and has different factors to them that dictates what happens with their water quality and different challenges for working with them. So then on to Long Pond here. Of course, so Long Pond's 2 basins. I haven't broken it up, but the deepest basin goes down to 106 feet. So we're going to talk about the upper basin first. So there you can see actually a fairly similar trend to Great Pond and other ponds, where you get the stratification sets in June, and then anoxia starts to develop and phosphorus gets released, and then it turns over at the end of October. You can see looks like we didn't actually get out on the lake after it turned over. I think I remember that. Took quite a while for it to finally turn over completely. The average Secchi depth was 19 feet, so that's pretty good. And the volume average phosphorus was 8 parts per billion, so that was quite good. I'm not sure if Pete Callan is on the call, but he wanted us to collect some phosphorus measurements near July 4th, and you can see there's 5 measurement points before and after July 4th. And so actually the phosphorus is increased, but probably that's when the lake starts getting really busy. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the lake when the phosphorus starts to increase in July. So trying to pinpoint what those exact causes of increases in phosphorus at that time is quite hard. But yeah, so we start to see increases even in the surface phosphorus in July in Long Pond. But overall, the averaged phosphorus is quite good. In the lower basin, on the other hand, we have quite different patterns. And so water comes in, we still get the stratification set up, but actually, so one thing I want to point out is our measuring equipment can kind of sometimes gets down to the bottom and sometimes doesn't, because it only goes down about 100 feet. But you see there's anoxia at the bottom of Long Pond in the lower basin here. But also you get this what's called a metalimnetic oxygen minimum. So in the thermocline, you get this low of oxygen. And so in Long Pond, it could be due to water coming over from the basin, from the upper basin, which kind of settles in, if it has algae in it, that's decaying, that'll consume oxygen. It could just be from algae in the lake kind of settling on the thermocline and also decaying, and that consumes oxygen. So you get this oxygen minimum every year in the lower basin of Long Pond, and it's fairly consistent. So in addition to the low oxygen at the bottom, you get this minimum. So then moving on to Messalonsky. This is our deepest lake at 113 feet depth. Looking at the water quality from here, and again, Messalonsky also has this, Messalonsky also gets this metalimnetic oxygen minimum. So we get this low of oxygen in the middle of the water column. And we were out on November 6th. I think it's off the graph here, and it was still stratified and still anoxic at the bottom. So it takes a long time for some of these deep lakes to turn over. And so the longer, though, that they're stratified and anoxic, the more time, more phosphorus can come out. And you can see the average in Messalonsky was about 16 feet in terms of Secchi. The volume average phosphorus is 14 parts per billion, which is also on the higher side for our lakes. So I put together this graph. I'm going to talk you through it. And this kind of summarizes the water quality data from this year for all the lakes compared to the averages from 2015 to 18. So if a number is green, that means that number is a pretty good number. So that's not something we need to be worried about. If it's yellow, it's something we should probably be keeping an eye on. It's not red, which would mean you're hitting like eutrophic area. So we're good in that regard. And none of the lakes have Secchi or phosphorus that indicates that they're getting close to eutrophic conditions. But then additionally, the blue arrows mean a positive, that the numbers this year is better than it was in the past, and the red arrows mean it's worse than it has been in the last 4 years. So starting with East Pond, well, we're very glad to see that it's improved in both, because it should after the alum treatment. We've seen a halving of the phosphorus level, an increase of 6 feet in the Secchi depth, and so things are looking good in terms of progress on that lake. North Pond is borderline at the moment. Because of last year, because the 2015 to 17 weren't bad years, when you take the average of them, they equal the same as it was last year. But what that means is that we're actually reverting towards the average conditions, which is good. We're on the right direction with our trend. So I'm hoping that in North Pond that we'll see a good summer this year. So in Great Pond, all our numbers look good, but we are seeing declining trends in both Secchi and phosphorus. We see the Secchi and phosphorus, not a trend. The Secchi and phosphorus last summer were worse than they were in the previous summers. And that you see that in the anoxic factor as well. Finally, with McGraw, we see that again, the Secchi is good, but it has declined from the summer before, and the phosphorus has increased non-trivially from 2015 to 2018. So that's something we need to keep an eye on. And salmon, the phosphorus is actually decreased. So it's still high though. So that's something we're watching. But the Secchi depth went up by a foot last year compared to the previous year. So this is again, like sometimes there's a lot of interconnected processes that phosphorus doesn't mean algae immediately. You can have perfectly good water quality even with high phosphorus, but eventually that phosphorus has to come out and it's going to be used up. In Long Pond in the upper basin, we did see a decrease in the average Secchi depth compared to previous years, but the total phosphorus in the lake remained the same. In the lower basin, we also saw the average Secchi was lower this year than in the past 4 years before that, and the phosphorus also increased. In Messalonskee, we also saw an increase in the phosphorus as well, and I'm wondering, we've done the calculations for Great Pond, but I imagine if we did the anoxic factor calculations for Long Pond and Messalonskee as well, that we would see an increase in the time of anoxia last summer, which probably is why we're seeing an increase in phosphorus in those lakes. So that's kind of a summary of all that data. I'm going to talk a bit about some of our future threats that we're dealing with. So the first is the issue of climate change. And so in this graph, what it shows is the average temperature in our summer months over the past 100 years. And so we all know that the temperatures are increasing, but in particular, the one that is worrisome for our region of Maine, is that August temperatures are increasing faster than other months. And August is kind of this prime water quality month that really kind of that's when we start having our cyanobacterial blooms, when they happen. And so warmer August means longer, stronger stratification, more periods of anoxia, more phosphorus release from the sediments, and then the warmer water is better conditions for cyanobacteria. So we do have to keep this is we're working against a trend. When we're doing lake management, we're working against a trend that wants the water quality to become worse just because it's going to get warmer. So I'm mostly included this because I know it's a concern for many people in the lake associations. And Scott Williams came and gave a talk at the MLRC in the autumn, but I just want to kind of summarize some of that. But so there's actually not a lot of good real data on metaphyton, but anecdotally people feel that it is increasing. But the cause of the metaphyton growth are not well understood. So like Lake Tahoe has metaphyton, and Lake Tahoe is known for being one of the clearest lakes in the world. So, it likes sunlight, it likes nutrients like all plants do. So we really actually don't know what the drivers are. There's hypotheses that it has to do, possibly bad septics can contribute to metaphyton growth, or runoff directly from properties, because it's a shoreline type problem. And so, but we don't actually know for certain what the biggest drivers are. So one thing that if you have metaphyton outside your dock and you're interested in getting involved, that Lake Stewards of Maine does have a metaphyton monitoring kind of program. And the more data we can get that looks at trends and where it shows up, the more we can start to understand why we get it and what we can do to manage it. So I did want to put that in there and to let you know that you should get in touch with the Lake Stewards of Maine if you're interested in helping them with that. So the last thing I'm going to talk about are cyanotoxins. So cyanobacteria can produce toxins, which particularly microcystin and BMAA, and these can have adverse effects on humans and animals if they're consumed in sufficiently high quantities. So you need a fair amount in order to get sick. Most of the dog deaths that we saw come up last summer, not in Maine, because we haven't had any in Maine, have been attributed to microcystin, and so it's different the way it interacts with dogs in particular. But so when they drink it, when they swim, but we haven't had that level of cyanotoxin concentrations in Maine yet. So in the Belgrades, the risk is currently low, but this can change rapidly if we don't take care of our lakes and watersheds. So we definitely have to be on our toes about this, but it's currently not an active threat. There's a lot of unknowns about what levels of microcystin and BMA start impacting human health. So again, there's so many unknowns in this question. But one of the big things that's important to know is that why and when cyanobacteria produce toxins is a very hot topic right now in the water research community, because there's no really good answers that let us know and be able to predict when it will happen. Just because you have cyanobacteria and even cyanobacteria blooms like a lot does not mean you have cyanotoxins. So one is necessary. So it's important that people understand that your lake can still be safe even if it's a bit green. But you shouldn't swim in scums, and you shouldn't let your pets drink green scums of water. You have to be smart. And even if it's, people get skin irritation if anything, even if it is an internal toxin. But through the Seven Lakes Alliance Colby Water Quality Initiative, we're working on methods. Whitney's working with methods at Colby to help us detect microcystins so that we can add this into our water quality monitoring program. It's tricky, and we're still experimental, but we're starting to get some results. And this is how we know that the risk is generally pretty low, because we haven't seen numbers that exceed any of the guidelines for microcystin given by the EPA. But we're keeping an eye on this, and it's something that we're actively working on, because it really is one of the key water quality concerns of many people. So we don't have the ability to measure BMAA at the moment, but in general, the toxin levels are low across Maine. But we really need to work to keep phosphorus out of our lakes, to reduce cyanobacteria, so that we can make sure our lakes stay resilient and healthy into the future. So that's kind of an overview of future threats. And just two more things. Was the last thing. We do actually have data on a website. These are the websites here. We'll get them up on our website. I'm still working on streamlining the websites, but on one of them you can see our most recent profiles, because I can just upload them there. Whitney's been out doing water sampling for me since he's a essential employee. So I'll try and get his profiles up this week. So you can just click through and see what the most recent data is from any of our lakes. On the other side, once we get Goldie in, which we haven't yet, but we're hoping to do soon, you can see the data from Goldie. In this case, the solar panel battery started dying, so that's why we have gaps in the data. But in general, you can see either the last week, 24 hours, or 30 days of data. So we'll put a link up on our website so that people can click to the more real-time data as we go along in the summer. So anyway, that's what we have for questions. So now we have time for questions. Like I said, I'm experimenting with this webinar feature of Zoom. So I have questions from a bunch of people here on the side. So the first question here is is there any wash effect, do you think, when the waves wash over the shore and drag metals into the lake? So I'm guessing that means, I think when we have shoreline erosion, we're dragging sediments, and the sediments will contain a variety of different, we'll have a variety of different chemical components to them, whether that's phosphorus and metals. And so we certainly might expect to see shoreline erosion can will bring sediments into the lake. Whether or not they just stay near the shoreline or move around kind of depends on the lake and how big it is and how much the wind will drive motions. And so we'd expect on bigger lakes that it might move more than on the smaller lakes. Okay, so Barbara asked, did you measure the wake impact on shoreline erosion and disturbance of sediments as the wave passes through the shallow water near the shore? And we did not, and that's what we want to do this summer, because we think that might be kind of the bigger impact of wake bows, of very large wakes, which are about 3 feet high. So that's something we would like to do this summer. So Maddie asked, why does some ponds show a red arrow when the Secchi is lower than previous arrows? Oh, maybe did I miss let me go back to my graph. Okay, yeah, so this is because the Secchi should be a big number. And so Maddie was wanting me to clarify this graph here. The Secchi should be a deep number, right? So if the Secchi was 21 feet on Great Pond in 2015 to 18, and it was only 18 feet in 19, that means that the Secchi, we have 3 feet less of clarity in 2019 than in previous years. So just to clarify that, sorry for that confusion. So, but with phosphorus, of course, the number goes up. The Secchi, the red arrow means that the SECI measurements have gone down in the sense of they're worse than they were the year between 2015 and 2018. Okay, based upon the data to date, you have a sense of what portion of phosphorus in Great Pond is due to external versus internal loading. So the science committee has met, and we've kind of been discussing this very question. And basically, we have a range somewhere between, so there's a bunch of different ways to try and estimate it. And the range is probably somewhere between 25 and 40%. And that's not a very, we're trying to narrow that down. And it's really quite a complex question, because there's a lot of things that go into the watershed models that determine it, but also we have a lot of data that lets us try and back this out in a different way. So, so Ken Wagner's been working on the watershed component with Jen Jesperson, and then, Whitney and I have been looking at the in-lake data. And so we're trying to come to some conclusions about that, because that really is the driver of what the best management strategy is. And in terms of, will we be in a position by the summer to make recommendations for possible remediation of phosphorus in Great Pond? We have there's a technical committee meeting and a steering committee meeting in May. And I think the point is, I'm not sure when in the summer the goal is to be able to make management recommendations, but we need to nail down the data. And I believe that's something we will be doing this year. That I'm not sure what exact timeline is, because again, we have to meet with there's a lot of different things that will go into these decisions. So that's where we are with the Great Pond data. We have a kind of a sense of the numbers, but there's still a lot of questions about what the best way to deal with that is. So then our cyanotoxin is the same as blue-green algae. Yes, so cyanobacteria and blue-green algae are basically the same thing, and the cyanotoxins are produced by the cyanobacteria or the blue-green algae. So you can have cyanobacteria and blue-green algae, but no cyanotoxins, but you need cyanobacteria and blue-green algae in order to have cyanotoxins. So Lisa asked, we had metaphyton in our cove last year on Long Pond. It showed up after pollen settling on the water. Do you think it may be associated with the low water level of pollen that settled from the air? My guess is probably doesn't have to do anything with the pollen settling from the air. I don't know what the impacts of the low water levels are. It's basically, it likes the things that plants like, right? So it wants light, it wants nutrients, and when you have those things, then it will grow, but it doesn't grow everywhere. So it's kind of why this is a big question. So this is actually, I don't have a good answer, because we don't actually know much about what the mechanisms behind metaphyton growth are. So Joy asks, of all the external factors that influence lower water quality, what has the worst effect? That's a good question, and how to kind of put it down in one simplify that into one answer. I mean, I think for most of our lakes, the watershed contribution of phosphorus is the largest percent of the amount of phosphorus going in the lakes. There's only so much you can do about that phosphorus, right? There's a limit to how much we can do Lake Smart programs, how we can work on roads to reduce erosion, all these things. But your watershed condition is really one of these key drivers of what's going to happen in your lake. But on the flip side, there's some if you have historical phosphorus in your lake that came from the watershed at some point in history, then that will never go away without some kind of mitigation strategy. So the thing we have most control over is what we do in our watersheds to reduce erosion, reduce runoff, minimize the amount of phosphorus that goes in, because in most of our lakes, that is the largest source of phosphorus, and phosphorus is what drives your cyanobacterial blooms. Okay, so Dace asked, surely there's a difference in water quality between the wide section in Sydney and the narrow section of Messalonskee and Oakland. Do we have phosphorus in Sydney near the swampy end? We actually, I don't think we have done a full transect of Messalonskee, and we have 2 sampling locations. I only showed the one because actually we do find that the one that's kind of near there. I could show them on a map, but there's one that's closer to Oakland, and there's one that's right off the Snow Pond Center for the Arts. So we generally, the Snow Pond Center for the Arts is the deep hole there. So that's what we do. That's where we focus on with our measurements. So we don't actually go north of. We don't really go. It's not north, south of there. I guess it is, right? I always get myself turned around and mess along too, which directions which. Towards the wider end. We don't really go towards the wider end there. And we haven't actually done a transect of water quality there, but that's probably a worthwhile thing to do sometime, just to kind of, because it's quite a big lake and we're really kind of focusing on this one point of it. So, okay, well, that was the last of the questions in the Q&A. Let's see here. So I was gonna, so if anybody, I guess we can try the raising hand. There's this raising hand option that we're still working with. So if someone has a question they want to ask, we can unmute you at this point too, if we can figure it out. So there's Lenny. Okay, Lauren, I can't seem to unmute Lenny because I think you're the host. Can you unmute him? Oh, wait, there I go.
Hi there.
Hi, Lenny.
Oh, hi. Let's see. Can you see me? I don't know if you can or not.
No, but I can see your name, so.
Oh, I don't know why you can't see me, but okay, that's fine. You can hear me though.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, my question is, the way you were talking about Salmon Lake and how most of the water quality issues seem to come from the area around the deep hole. Would it be worth? I mean, is there any sense whatever in considering doing an alum treatment just in maybe 100 to 200 acres in the area of the deep hole rather than a much larger part of the lake, or would that not possibly do any good?
I think you need to, for the alum treatment to be effective, you need to cover the area that goes anoxic. So in salmon, I'm trying to remember I don't know what, I'd have to look to see those numbers of basically where the level of anoxia is, what the area of the lake is at that depth, and so that's kind of your limiter in one of these, in the ways that you might, you might manage it with alum. So I haven't, so in salmon, it'd probably necessarily be a much smaller treatment just because that deep hole area isn't incredibly large, right? Yeah, so I mean, that certainly is one management option to keep that phosphorus down. I mean, I think, that's where we start thinking about, well, is that phosphorus having an impact now? I mean, for all we know, actually, it might just get dumped into Great Pond and not really stay in salmon all that long, right? So that's one of the things we're trying to do is better understand what these phosphorus fluxes are. So what happens when the phosphorus comes up? We know it blooms, but does it stay in salmon? So that make sense for us to try and keep it in the sediments? So yes, I mean, possibly that, I mean, it's certainly a viable management strategy. I mean, that's why we're discussing it on Great Pond as well as a possible option where you have these deep holes that might be an effective management strategy. So, I mean, I do think a lot of that there's a good chunk of phosphorus coming from the deep hole in salmon. And so it's something that should be explored possibly.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see, does anyone have any other questions they want to ask? With the raise hand, if you raise your hand, then we can unmute you. Okay, well, it looks like that's it. I'm happy to answer any other questions that people might have over email. If you just want to, you can give me a call, email me, and my, I can tell you the best way to get in touch with me. I'm happy to have a chat on the phone if you prefer that. This summer is very much a mystery for us about how things are going to work out, just because we're unlikely to have Colby students. And so, I'm relying on volunteers, and I'm happy to say I have volunteers on every lake to help take us out to get some of these measurements. So we'll continue keeping on trying to get this to understand how things are going this summer. It's actually going to be really interesting because last year we thought, okay, well, late ice off, cool spring, this is going to be a good water quality year. But in the end, it actually, we had a lot of long stratification period. And so this year, we had an early ice off. So it'll be interesting to see if we have long of a stratification period again this year. And so it's important for us to get that data so we know. So we know when the stratification sets up and all the subsequent water quality impacts. Anyway, well, thank you everybody for spending your Wednesday night with me. It was, I hope you all learned something, and please feel free to ask me any questions that you want some clarification.